Baradaran, the author of Color of Money, Black Banks, and the Racial Wealth Gap. My name is Oluwatomi Logadado, and I'm a junior public policy major here at the University of Maryland. As a junior undergraduate student, I serve as Director of Advocacy for Black Students in Public Policy, or BSIP, and I'm also a member of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Task Force, or DIB. Thank you, and I would like to turn over to Mr. Baker, former county executive of Prince George's County and president and CEO of Baker Strategy Group.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to tonight's conversation. I'm really excited about tonight's conversation. I want to, on behalf of the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, Black Friday, and our chief financial sponsor, AT&T, Professor Baradaran, I want to welcome you to Maryland and to this discussion tonight. Just briefly, I discovered Professor Baradaran's book about 6 months ago. I was looking for some new ways of thinking about the issues that were happening around the country, whether social justice, health disparity, or wealth inequality. And I really was looking for ways that elected executive leaders could address those issues and think about them, and more importantly, do something about them. And so in my research, I came across a presentation that Professor Baradaran gave to the Economic Policy Institute. And I was fascinated by the presentation. And so I ordered the book. I found the book amazing. And I said to myself, I wish I had read this book when I was county executive. And actually, I don't know if you remember, Professor, but you talked about Prince George's County in your presentation that day. And so I decided I wanted everyone to read this book. It became on my Christmas list. So I wanted county executives, mayors, and county judges, and especially what we're going through in today's time, to be able to have a discussion around these difficult conversations and uncomfortable conversations with everybody, not just people of color, but with everyone. And so I wanted to have the opportunity for you to present the book, especially to those who are part of the cohort that we have in our Excel program with the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Because the idea of the cohort is to give these executives new ways of thinking about these issues. Because let's face it, at the local level is really where, to use an old cliche, where the rubber hits the road. That's where citizens expect, because they see these mayors, they see these county judges, they see these legislators every day. That's where they expect change to happen. And so what we wanted to have is this great conversation and ideas for them. And I found the book fascinating, and I wanted as many people as possible, especially those in executive leadership, to hear about it, to talk about it, to think about it. Because that's where real and systemic change is going to happen at the local, city, county, and state level. So I'm excited about what we're going to talk about tonight. And before I introduce our chief financial sponsor for this evening, I do want to just say to Aisha Washington, who made it possible that we brought you here. I've been talking about you for 6 months, and she made it happen. So I'm excited. I want to thank Aisha Washington for doing that and bringing the speaker tonight. So let me introduce Latara Harris, who is from AT&T, our chief sponsor, who's the regional director in external and legislative affairs for DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Latara, you have a lot of things going on, so I'm going to give you the chance to say a few words.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. County Executive, and thank you all so much for your attention tonight. I'm just absolutely pleased to be here to bring greetings on behalf of our employees throughout the country. I love seeing all of those that are coming up in the chat. I see Anne Arundel County, hello, County Executive Pittman, and I saw Westchester, New York, keep them in. We love to see all of the energy that's around the table. So I just thank you, Mr. County Executive, for your vision around and your help with all of this work. And Dean Orr, absolutely tremendous work that you're doing in bringing this very important conversation to the stage in a major way. And certainly, Ms. Washington, for all you're doing. And Tony, I love public policy majors. I'm telling you, you have my heart. That's what I do for a living, and you're in for a real treat for yourself. So I wanted to thank you all on behalf of AT&T. I'm based here in Washington, D.C. These conversations we know for our company are critical to our communities, for people that are trying to figure out a way and really bringing that, the truth and the energy that Professor Baradaran is going to bring is something that we value tremendously. I've been with the company now. I'll be celebrating, I guess, 8 years next week. I've had interactions with the county executive, very fair county executive. He has been tremendous for our county. I'm a Prince George's County resident, undergraduate at Bowie, and I did my master's at the University of Maryland, my MBA. So again, I thank you all so much for the opportunity to be, hey, Delaware, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and have a fantastic event. Thank you.
Thank you, Latara, Rashern, and Tony. You've gotten us kicked off just so. I'm Bob Orr, the Dean of the School of Public Policy, and it is my great pleasure to welcome everyone this evening. I will be briefly introducing our speaker this evening, and I say briefly because I really want to hear from her. Professor Mehrsa Baradaran is a force in social justice, and it gives me great pleasure to call a professor a force in social justice. When you conceive of academia in the right way, you can make stuff happen. And our guest tonight is doing exactly that. Professor Baradaran is a professor of law at UC Irvine Law School. I would love to say that she fits in a public policy school even better than a law school, but we won't get into that issue tonight. Professor Baradaran's work is broad. It has made an impact in the policy community. Professor Baradaran is sought out not only for her writings and her presentations, but she has testified many times before Congress, various committees. She is a regular on the media. I think she is what I like to call an action academic. I would never say that about someone when they're going up for tenure, but it's the highest compliment I can give to a professor is that you are an action academic, Professor Baradaran, and you've chosen a topic that cuts right to the heart of what we are about at the School of Public Policy, the nexus of race issues, of social justice issues, and of policy. So I welcome you tonight, and we could not be happier to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. These are very, very kind introductions. And let me I usually don't kind of talk about the writing of a book or a research project. And I did initially start this project as an academic exercise I wanted to use, it was a broader project. You use Black banks or immigrant banks or just a case study in the history of Black banking to show things that I had already kind of discussed in my academic research prior to this, which is the tensions in the Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian versions of community banking versus public policy. And my theory of the case had always been that public policy and federal, local, state interventions in policy matter much more than the market actors themselves. And I wanted to use this as an example of showing that. And as I started digging into this research, I got angrier and angrier and angrier. I cannot imagine someone having gone into the archives and read this stuff and not writing a polemic. And I tried as hard as I could to bring it down to footnote and to cite. But if you could feel my rage in this book, then you get how it was written, because it really I did not anticipate to find such purposeful and repeated and constant blocking of the efforts, the good efforts of the entrepreneurs and the Black bankers historically. And so the book is about the racial wealth gap. And again, it started out as an exercise for Black banks, and then it eventually went to being about the racial wealth gap. So I will go through some data real quick. And this is the racial wealth gap today. And I want to talk about how the role of credit policies, economic theories, and banking policy in creating and perpetuating it, and to explore also why the racial wealth gap hasn't abated over time. So in 1865, the Black community had controlled 0.5% of the nation's wealth. This is at the dawn of emancipation, so that makes sense. Today, it's around 1 to 1.5%. So to say that our public policy efforts to eradicate, and I'm putting efforts in quotes, to eradicate the racial wealth gap has been a total failure is an understatement. And mostly, it is the myths that we tell about markets. These are the myths that I grew up sort of in academia, on Wall Street, in law school, in my undergrad, hearing about markets. The myths and these present the biggest obstacles, I think, today to achieving racial justice and closing the racial wealth gap. For example, the promise of free market capitalism is that it does not discriminate, that free markets offer equal opportunity for all to trade and prosper based on one's skill and ability. So even if you're an anti-market, Marxist, or if you're pro-market, Adam Smith, the idea is that money goes to the highest good, or property is capital that you can grow, right? But it all comes down to policy and law, because if you have property and the law isn't protecting it, or if you have property and the law is depriving you of your earned rights, then capitalism doesn't work. So alternatively, either markets do discriminate, which I don't think is the case. What I do think is the case is that the American economy has never borne any resemblance to a free market. For most of our history, Black men and women have been excluded from occupations, schools, neighborhoods, and trade, and their property was not protected by law, the basic premise of capitalism. In each historical moment in America where wide middle-class wealth is being created, so Homestead Act, FHA mortgage loans, GI bills, we can take it to the subprime crisis where it was extraction, but also wealth creation. Black communities were shut out of land and wealth accumulation. Sometimes it was purposeful, often. More recently, it has been a byproduct of historic legacies that were never remedied, and also some purposeful blocks as well. And the most pernicious thing, I think, the thing that got me angriest during this research is that at certain pivot points in history, specifically during Reconstruction and during the Civil Rights era, where the call to justice, where the Black communities and their allies were demanding state intervention and capital to remedy clear historic injustice, the rhetoric of free market capitalism has been used as a weapon to undercut these claims. And instead of real reform, the Black community has been offered a self-help market of segregated banks and businesses. And I think we're at that pivot point again, which is why I hope that we can take the lessons of this history to heart as we propose and respond to public policy efforts today. In other words, leaders upholding a white-dominated market institution promised, and have continued to promise, that the market would fix the problems that had been created by law and backed by private and law-sanctioned violence. So quickly, I want to go through this history and to show that insofar as the levers of power and public policy were held by the institutions of race-based sort of hierarchy, that the markets would perpetually block capital accumulation for Black communities. So starting with Reconstruction, we talk about slavery, or when I've heard people talk about slavery, it's usually about the labor extortion of slavery, right? So the cotton produced by slave labor. But an important part of enslavement was that the men and women held as slaves were capital, on which more capital could be built through leverage and through lending. And large markets were built on not just the capital in the bodies, the property in man, but also in the production of their labor. So it was a real dual benefit here. And at the dawn of Reconstruction, so I won't go through the economics of slavery, but it's an important point to make. The very currency of the South, and this is actually Southern currency, and the trade and the banking system was based on slavery. And so during Reconstruction, the freedmen were expected to transition from being capital themselves to becoming capitalists. And freedmen and their abolitionist allies demanded land as a form of reparations. And by the way, many demanded it as a punishment to the treasonous Confederates. Without land, they reasoned, freedom and justice would be meaningless and participation in capitalism would be a farce. Yet President Andrew Johnson vetoed the land grant with the 40 acres and a mule, which was part of the Freedmen's Bureau bill. And except for one provision, which I'll talk about, he reasoned that the freedmen would be protected by the free market and by contract law, that they would bargain for fair wages and buy their own land. So this was either unbelievably naive or incredibly cynical. The Southern economy was nothing like a free market. White men refused to sell property to Blacks. State legislators, lawyers, judges drafted laws governing every aspect of Black labor. They restricted Black men and women from skilled trades. Vagrancy laws were prevalent. Wages were capped by law and by cabal between the employers, and violations led to convict labor, so another extractive force. So by the end of Reconstruction, most freedmen were left landless, voteless, and with practically every profession blocked to them, except for growing cotton. Of course, that was the entire point. The worldwide cotton market was heavily dependent on cheap and abundant cotton from the United States. And in order to have cotton exports at a fixed price, so if you look at commodity prices, we don't like fluctuations. So think of oil. If cotton was oil today, or any sort of commodity that we rely on for vast global markets, and all of a sudden you thought the price of oil was going to go up phenomenally, exponentially, you would want that to stop. And what had happened in Haiti was that when the freedmen and women there gained emancipation through, beating off their oppressors, sugar output halted. They refused to grow sugar, some grew it, but as a cash crop, while they also took their plots of land and grew subsistence crops, which is what any landowner does. You would grow half of your land to feed your family, and the other half or a third, depending on the market, would be for a cash crop. What happens when that output halts? Prices skyrocket, which is good for the landowners who are growing cotton, really bad for the merchants in the north, really bad for the merchants in Liverpool. So there was every reason to believe that freed American slaves would go this route, and this was very well documented in the memos and telegrams sent across trading lines. Black men and women were denied land, not because the government was constrained by laissez-faire, but because, as Andrew Johnson explained, America was and should remain a white man's government. During this time, the federal government was actively providing free land to homesteaders and expansion of the railroads, free land to the railroad and post. So it wasn't as though giving land away was anathema. It was though you couldn't give land to freedmen because you needed that cotton growth. So instead of land, the freedmen and women got a bank. In 1865, the Union General, sorry, just change the light. Union General Oliver Otis Howard explained that the bank was better anyway because it would teach about thrift and savings, that freedmen should earn land and not receive it as a gift. The Freedmen's Savings Bank, if you're picking up historical similarities, that is purposeful. A lot of this rhetoric, you should earn it, it's about personal responsibility, comes up after, enslavement at the dawn of emancipation, land being taken away, and basically a re-enslavement post-Reconstruction. People are lecturing freedmen on how to save their money and to buy land so that they could earn it and feel good about themselves. Okay, and they did, of course. The Freedmen's Savings Bank was quite successful. It drew deposits from all sorts of freedmen from all over the South. No bank before or ever since the Freedmen Bank resembled it. It was created by Congress, signed into law by Lincoln by special charter, and the bank was immediately successful. And one of the main reasons that the bank was trusted was that the money seems to be backed by the full faith and credit of the Treasury. Why? Because the bills and notes in the building were covered with government insignia. The notes seemed to be showing government backing. Why does that matter? At the time, we didn't have FDIC insurance. The Treasury wasn't issuing currency like it is today. Most bank notes were valued based on the reputation of the bank. So if you got a note from JP Morgan that was $100, it would be worth $100 because it was JP Morgan's bank. If it was some podunk bank in Eastern Maryland or Western Maryland, wherever the rural part is, you would discount it because you didn't know if that bank was going to be there when you went to go redeem your note. So the reason this government insignia was important is because it allowed for those deposits to swell the bank's coffers. And they did, of course. There's $1.5 billion of deposits that came in. The bank was never going to lend loans. It was not to be a commercial bank. It was supposed to be a glorified piggy bank to just hold the savings, which would have been valuable in and of itself. It wasn't capitalism. There was no lending, but it would have been okay if it had just kept the money. Of course, you can imagine what happens. The white manager of the bank, Henry Cook, whose brother was the infamous Wall Street speculator Jay Cook, took the deposits and basically looted the bank. It was railroad stock speculation, like the subprime market of the day. He speculated the money away and lost it. And the significance of this failure reverberated and lingered through the Black community. So those who lost their deposits, there was no FDIC insurance. There was no there was no backing from the full faith and credit of the federal government. And Black leaders and bankers for almost a century repeated the assertion that the failure of the bank had caused the Black community to completely lose trust in the federal government and in the banking sector. So W.E. Du Bois says in Black Reconstruction, not even 10 additional years of slavery could have done so much to throttle the thrift of the freedmen as the mismanagement and bankruptcy of the Freedmen's Bank chartered for the nation for their special aid. I began this project, like I said, as looking through the FDIC. My first book was on unbanked and underbanked. And one of the data that stuck out to me was the vast racial disparities in unbanked and underbanked populations racially. And in the Black population, especially in the South, something like 60% of the Black population was unbanked or underbanked. And the number one reason was a lack of trust in banks. And I've asked this from audiences when I lecture across the country, whose grandmother, grandfather, father told them not to trust a bank with your savings, right? So this is something that Black bankers talk about to this day, about this distrust in banking because of hard-earned wages being taken away by the Freedmen's Bank. So by the time the bank failed, the disenfranchisement of the Black population was complete. The rights written into the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were nullified by legislators, courts, the police power of the South, and the paramilitary violence of the Klan. And in a series of decisions between 1873 and 1898, the Supreme Court weakened the rights of Black citizens and blessed Jim Crow disenfranchisement, outlawing the Civil Rights Act of 1875 as unconstitutional. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court wrote 20 years after the end of slavery. He says that it was high time for the slaves to stand on their own 2 feet and stop being treated as, and I quote, as the special favorite of the law. Okay, so you already are seeing signs of this reverse discrimination. And why are we, doing special favors for freedmen? In fact, for the next century, and to this day, the 14th Amendment came up more to defend corporations against state overreach than it did to protect Black men and women from the hostile arm of the state. And of course, we kind of can guess who the special favorite of the law actually is. So after the Freedmen's Bank, there was a blossoming of Black banks during the Jim Crow South, but it's a double-edged sword. These banks were a response to heavy Jim Crow and heavy Klan violence. You could not trust a white bank. The white bank would not take your deposits. And if they did, you weren't certain that you would not be mistreated and physically harmed for collecting them. This was a prevalent story that many had. And so many of the Black owned banks in the South were a response to this. Similar, Maggie Walker St. Luke's Penny Banks is this Women's History Month, I think. Are we still in that? She was the first woman of any race to start a bank. the first Black banker to be inducted into the Virginia Bankers Association. Her bank is one of a handful of banks that survives the Great Depression. Her bank actually, not herself, but her bank survives the Great Depression and goes down with the financial crisis of 2008. That decimated a lot of these small community banks. But her bank started from a church organization. She had a college savings fund. She had a newspaper. She had a school. She did everything. She provided for the community where there were needs, a burial society, insurance, and most of the banks that era, not quite as successful as hers, but most of them were this way. In 1910, you have the Great Migration North. It is met with heavy segregation, which leads to concentrated Black populations in northern cities. And you have banks, Jesse Binga's bank being one of the most successful. I thought that story in the book was one that, will enrage you, because he was a prominent Black banker in Chicago, a good banker. He was a very successful banker, and during the Great Depression, his bank failed, as do other banks, although it was a really terrible story because he had made safeguards against his bank's failure. Anyway, he's the only banker to be imprisoned for a bank failure during the Great Depression. It's a really tragic story. But even during this time, when segregation was complete, Black banks were unable to grow wealth in Black communities. And this is one of the nuggets in the book, which I will skip over, but it was the thesis that I was going at when I first started the book. The idea that you can have banks taking deposits and making loans in a segregated economy, and that would create wealth in that community is a fiction. It's a farce. And I show why that is through these balance sheets. Essentially, it comes down to their assets were on loans to homes. And in that era, and to this day, Black homes in Black communities, because of segregation, do not retain their home values. It is less dramatic today, but it still is a major pernicious reason for the racial wealth gap to exist. In other words, white homes in white communities, and whiteness, of course, is a broad label that is expansive and amorphous. It is just non-Black. White communities, white homes gain value by nature of not being in Black communities. And so that is where racism and that history is embedded in value and in capital today. The New Deal, of course, is a massive restructuring of the banking system and really creates, this is the second pivot point of the creation of massive wealth for the middle class between 1933 and 1970, low inequality indexes, hundreds of thousands of small community banks, credit unions, thrifts are formed. They're safe, stable, profitable. This is the George Bailey myth. This is the myth I was trying to go at in the origins of the book, because it's all being written on FHA loans. Banks are thriving, as are communities, because the New Deal takes the risk out of banking. Deposits are insured by FDIC insurance. Loans are insured and guaranteed by the FHA and the GI Bill and the Farm Loan Bill, and they're sold in a secondary market by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So the risk is low. In banking, we talk about 3-6-3 banking: 3% on deposits by law, 6% on loans by law. You're on the golf course by 3 p.m. You're just printing money. Okay. This built the middle class. It created intergenerational wealth. It is the sort of MAGA, make America great again, that people pine for. The New Deal also built the lily white suburb of homeowners and a segregated Black neighborhoods through redlining. And the HOLC appraisers went around the country using census data and elaborate questionnaires to predict the likelihood of risk. This was initial FICO scores and risk profiling. You can't determine who is worthy of a loan. It wasn't as though they gave loans to credit-worthy borrowers. They took two tenant workers, two industrial workers in Manhattan, both of whom were paying $50 in rent. One got to get a $35 mortgage for a home in Levittown with the parks and the bowling alley and the schools, and one got to pay $50 in rent. And the way that they determined who got those loans was the neighborhoods that they could live in, and they were their race. Okay, so race was the number one indicator that they use for perceived risks. This is one example. This is Atlanta. You can go, there's this website called Mapping Inequality by Richmond University, and they have uploaded all of these maps, the actual redlining maps and the write-outs for every neighborhood. And you can see the way that they describe the racial elements of each neighborhood. So sometimes it says subversive races. Sometimes it'll say, oh, there's, Mexicans and, other subversive, undesirable races. Sometimes it'll just say Black or whatever, but really that's a number one predictor. So this neighborhood is in Atlanta. It is where Spelman and Morehouse and Atlanta University, which it was at the time, the best neighborhood in Georgia, probably one of the best neighborhoods in the country, best being judged by the way that you judge neighborhood quality. So single family homes, businesses, parks, all the desirable elements of a neighborhood. And if you look at inhabitants, it says, foreign born 0%, Black, Negro, yes, 100%, infiltration of. So that was a big predictor. How likely is this neighborhood to be infiltrated by undesirable races or racially inharmonious? So this led, of course, to two different credit markets. One in the white suburb where you're building that wealth, you're getting that home equity. And by the way, the FHA had a consumer lending arm, which I talk about in the book. I won't go into here, but with those homes, there was also a revolving credit scenario where you got a credit card, you got to go to Montgomery Ward and Sears and, furnish your home, buy your car, all of that stuff with interest rate cap credit card. In the Black neighborhoods where there wasn't home equity, there was also no revolving credit. There was installment credit. And installment credit is night and day from revolving credit. Installment credit is where the lender, it's like Rent-A-Center, where you go to buy a couch, you pay 10 times as much, and the interest rates are high and they're bundled together. So if you buy a bunch of furniture, you miss one payment, the last payment, you lose all of it. It's not separatable. So that's important historically, because that is where the seeds of the civil rights era were planted in the movements in Harlem, in Detroit, in Richmond, and in Baltimore, and in Chicago. Real sort of community activism at state legislatures on that interest rates, on those contracts, the lending contracts, and on interest rates, which I'll get to in just a second. But I do want to say that some of the forces of segregation, of course, that was motivated by racism, and it started out first with bombings. Jesse Benga's house, I talked about the banker, his house was bombed 10 times and he kept moving back into a white neighborhood. Then, signs, there'd be, clan violence, but then it got sophisticated. It was racial covenants. So, the FHA told, realtors and, lenders to make sure that racial covenants were all in their homes. And this was the original creation of the HOA as well, was to enforce racial covenants. If you look up at any deed in any place in the country that was, before 1970, when they stopped becoming enforceable, you'll see a racial covenant. There's, someone, respectable white people, it'll say Caucasian race. And many of the parameters of whiteness, so what is Caucasian? What counts and what doesn't? Were these racial covenants being taken to court? So someone like me who, in some courts would determine, a Mongol, and some courts would determine to be, an Arab, and these are the old rules, but people would take cases like, well, I am Caucasian because look, the Middle East is right by the Caucasus Mountains, and they're like, yeah, but you're a Mongol, and you're not. So you would take in the skull measurements, and you'd be proving like, hey, I can move into this neighborhood because I'm technically, So this is where the parameters of whiteness was able to expand. One interesting parameter, and this is where public policy matters, and it doesn't, is that the Irish and the Italians were not white before the FHA. Explicitly, racial maps, lower races, technically, quote unquote, scientifically, were very much discriminated against. And once they got that FHA loan, we talk about that as a historical anomaly. So we didn't have to change hearts and minds. We didn't have to change behaviors, right? The Irish, were thought to be, just violent inherently and racially, and all that BS about that race, right? The inherent racial traits goes away once they're your neighbor in Levittown. So, this is my push for change policy first, close the racial wealth gap, worry about changing hearts and minds later. Okay, on to the civil rights movement. I will stop at some point by, because there's a lot more, but the two strands of the civil rights movement that usually get contrasted together, the Black nationalists, sort of Marcus Garvey to Malcolm X, really start going at these institutions as being, why are these white banks, these white lenders in our communities exploiting us? And that exploitation was very much about those installment contracts and the way that all of the stores that were coming into the ghetto were white and they were overcharging, and people knew they were being screwed. They weren't, dumb, right? They weren't taking it down, taking it just lying down, right? Adam Clayton Powell's movement, Marcus Garvey, all of that was just a response to this perceived exploitation. And some of it likened it to the anti-colonial fights. So this was the nationalist streak, but it wasn't that far away from Martin Luther King, who saw it differently, but also focused on this. So he took Martin Luther King, before the I Have a Dream speech, has a case that he takes to the Black community in the 50s, talking about our 5 agenda items for our movement is Black economic coherence and a boycott, right? So that Montgomery bus boycott, right? There was a Harlem boycott of a store on installment loans that started, and the store went to a court and said, this is unconstitutional. You can't boycott us for being racist, right? And the court says, well, sure you can, right? They can use their economic power. They can do this boycott. And so this informs then, the Montgomery bus boycott was an economic boycott. We will stop using the buses to put that pressure on to get public policy changes, right? What are the changes? Well, stop Jim Crow, stop segregation, all of this stuff. But the long game was economic redress. And so Martin Luther King, from the beginning to the end, the message was never forget racism, color blindness. It was not the whitewashed history. It was, we have come, we had a promissory note. This note was defaulted. We've been given a bad check. It's been marked insufficient funds. Martin Luther King talks about segregation. It's not to keep us apart. It is exploitation. It is economic. And Martin Luther King, of course, by 1968 is no longer being listened to when he's assassinated. But really between 1965 and 1968, the whole mood had already shifted. And I go through this again, but if you look back at Reconstruction, where you're all of a sudden having this backlash of like, well, why are you getting special rights? That same thing happened after that. The high sort of, flying rhetoric of the civil rights law, the voting rights law, Selma, all of that stuff was before 1965. By 1968, the mood was complete white backlash. Roger Wilkins of the NAACP says you couldn't pass the Emancipation Proclamation in Congress in 1966. And so, I follow this because I think we need to tell this story right. By 1967, Black poverty, half of Black children were growing up in deep poverty. Black men and women had, 1/5 of the total wealth as poor white families. Okay, and Martin Luther King, right? He took his family to the segregated Black ghetto in Chicago, and he says they were all, grumpy and depressed, by the end of the month. And I never saw racism like I saw in Chicago. Talk about the Kerner Commission that really drills down on this. But the important points too, I think, are that people like George Romney, the other sort of side of the Republican Party, George Romney calls the white suburbs a noose around the Black ghetto. George Romney is a very active mover in a force for integration. But of course, what happens is, the riots, which I go into, Nixon comes in power, and he's got the two sort of, it's all sort of anti-Black subliminal messages. This is according to his aide, John L. Rickman, didn't make that up. It was very much a strategy of law and order. And the other side of the strategy, which gets less talked about, is Black capitalism. And the reason it gets less talked about is because we're still living it. Black capitalism was a Nixon sort of his détente on race to take the sting out of the real justice demands of both the Black radicals and Martin Luther King's movement, and also to pretend like he was doing something, because that was the plank he was fighting. So Black capitalism was basically, as his opponent Hubert Humphrey says, it was capitalism without capital. And essentially, affirmative action, treasury deposits, opportunity zones. We're no longer calling them the ghetto. We're calling it enterprise zones. We're calling it, places where entrepreneurs can go get a win-win. I will fly through this because I want to leave room for questions. Reagan really hones that. His entire civil rights plank in his platform is tax cuts, because tax cuts is the cure to racism. The market will cure it, okay? Clinton, if you thought I was just gonna be against the Republicans, just keep waiting. Clinton really hones in on this. His HUD official is Andrew Cuomo, who talks about these zones as being, we can get niche banks to go in and get win-win profits. And Larry Summers, talks about how, that we don't need to do anything for these Black segregated neighborhoods. We just need incentives, and the entrepreneurs will make money, and that will fix the problem of race. And of course, they did find money. It was in subprime credit. It wasn't Black entrepreneurs. It was Wall Street, and the Black community lost 53% of their wealth. During this time, CDFI was created, the CRA, leading now to, I went light on Barack Obama. I was writing this. He didn't, to his credit, didn't up the scale on Black capitalism. He just kind of didn't do much. And it was aftermath of the financial crisis. So, and again, I will leave it at that. And then Donald Trump's opportunity zones. I am very hopeful that we are in a different place right now. Everything that our president right now has said seems to be indicating a change of pace. I probably can't say more because I have been trying to be influential in what happens, but I think that it is time to sort of shed these destructive myths that capitalism and tax credits and CDFIs will fix what robust public policy created. We cannot deflect the responsibility of economic equality onto Black communities alone. They did not cause it. It is not their problem to fix. So I will end with a W.E. Du Bois quote, and I will take this picture off because we are done with that. The quote is 1948, W. Du Bois says, the great problem of American democracy was that it had not yet been tried. So I will stop and leave some room for questions.
Wow, thank you. I said you were an action academic. That sounded like an action academic in action. Thank you. Your passion comes across. The analysis and the data is what I recognize in academia, but the passion is the extra special ingredient in this recipe. Rashern Baker, could I ask you to ask our guest the first question? I think you probably have more than one, but you get pride of place here, sir.
Thank you. I do, and I'll start with this one. First of all, thanks for the presentation. It was absolutely amazing, and I'm looking at the text that I'm getting from various folks here who are listening, and we've all agreed that you should rewrite the history book for the United States, but that's not my question. So, and I'm really fascinated by this, and that is, can you tell us a bit more about your personal background and how you came to focus on, Black banks? I have to say I was surprised when I saw the book and I saw you and I was like, wow, I never thought about this. How did you come to this book and to write about Black banks and racial wealth gap?
I mean, like I said, that was not my intent. I did not start wanting to write about Black banks. I did not think that I was the one to do it. I wanted to write about, I wrote about banks because I was on Wall Street and I saw all these myths during the financial crisis. I started in Wall Street well before the financial crisis, and I was being told a certain way the banking system worked. And then it wasn't that way. The Fed came in with all of this money and I all of a sudden kind of saw the curtain go down. And so I went into academia as a banking person and, really tried, with all of my articles up until this book to kind of reframe the way we think about banking in a way that is adequate to understanding, some of the flaws in that system. I've always focused on, the low income people. I grew up, poor. And so that's where the personal, connection is. And I started this project again, wanting to look at these banks outside the system and how to prove my larger point. And then I kept saying like, will someone send me the book? I kept asking the librarians and all my research, can I just get the book on Black banks? And surely someone has written this history. And this was a 10-year project. I actually wrote a whole nother book while this one was on the back burner. I've written a bunch of articles because I was waiting for someone else. And finally I talked to, several of my mentors who said like, no, you should write this because it needs to be a banking scholar that does it. You're not telling a history, you're telling a banking story that hopefully is widely applicable. And then once I started writing, it became different. I just let the research take me. And it really, when I was in these archives and reading this Nixon stuff, I was like, surely someone has written a book about Black capitalism. Yeah, I was surprised that I had to do this archival work. And I do hope, and I have seen a lot of other scholars dig into this, but I didn't do it without a lot of fear and trepidation. I went into this very cautiously because I always assumed I had to read 100 books for every chapter because I always assumed that there's surely someone else out there who has written this. And I think I just came to maybe nobody else cared about getting into the balance sheets. And because I did care, that I could do it. And if nobody read it, the thing in the back of my mind writing this book is like, it's okay, nobody will read it. Just write it and it's fine. I already had tenure. I was already a full professor. I was just like, just write the book that you need to write. Nobody will read it. And I've just been amazed that people have found it because it was an academic press book. It was not marketed as a bestseller. It's not a bestseller, but I'm surprised at the people who picked it up and have read it. So I'm incredibly humbled.
We have a number of county executives with us tonight on the line. We have other academics, action academics. We have many students. I would invite you all, if you want to ask Professor Baradaran a question, you can raise your virtual hand or you can put it in the chat. We can do either way. I do see that Yvette Downs has a question in the chat. Yvette, if you want to unmute yourself, you could ask it yourself or I could read it. And then we'll take up folks as they raise their hands or put things in.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate this and I appreciate this conversation. I have to say I haven't finished your book yet, but so I'm kind of asking to get to the end of the book to find out your recommendations. But I do want to preface it by saying I graduated from a predominantly white institution, but I did my junior year at a historically Black college, Spelman. And that is where I had, in my banking class, they actually talked about Black banks. And I know I would not have gotten that at Vassar. Okay. That was not, I've never got any of that in any of my I'm an economic major, did not get that kind of background. Okay. So I'm really, I'm not surprised you didn't find a lot on it. But I'm currently working in trying to look at this whole world of Black banking and what we in the government can do to support financial minority deposit institutions. And I guess I just want to know, how do you see Black banks playing into wealth creation, particularly when they're trying to survive? We're trying to, we have a government policy that says we should be promoting them and helping them to be stronger. How do we help them be stronger, and how do they play into this wealth creation?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And I think, toward the end, you won't find a ton of satisfying answers, but really, I think it's not the job of Black banks to fix the racial wealth gap. That is a problem that was created by the federal government. It was a problem that the banking system itself and the credit policies created. So I think what does need to happen is the MDIs, Black banks specifically, need to be at the head of the table when this discussion happens. But the money and the motive has got to come from the places where money comes from, which is the federal government policy, the Fed itself. I mean, look at the trillions created practically overnight to deal with the COVID crisis. When we want to fix problems, the resources are there. And it ends up being actually quite beneficial. The FHA was a win-win. I mean, the FHA fund kept its deposits, and the people who got those mortgage loans got the wealth. So we look toward Black banks, and I think part of looking toward Black banks is it's this decoy. Like, well, what can they do to fix the racial wealth gap? Which is like, they didn't create it. They're doing the best they can. As you said, they are barely surviving. The financial crisis took it down from 50 to 20. And even those 20, if you add up all of their capital, it's a bad weekend for JP Morgan. In fact, it's a fine for the racial discrimination that Bank of America did. How much wealth Bank of America extracted from the Black community during just the subprime crisis. The fees that they paid is more than the entire totality of the capital of Black banks. So I think head of the table, absolutely maintain, promote, but it is not their job to fix the racial wealth gap.
It's not their job, but what can we do to help how can they participate? If the government is supporting them, how can they actually what do we need to give to them to help them help
Capital.
The communities that they serve?
I mean, capital.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I do have a couple chapters on other proposals that have been made. I have I've written up, a proposal of mine called the Homestead Act, which is a government grant, runs like it's funded by the Import-Export Bank. I mean, I have lots of details in there if you want to look. Basically a land grant, taking up properties from, communities, formerly redline communities, handing over those properties redeveloped to the residents of those communities, the Black and brown residents, and with the development funds baked in. So it's like a redo of the FHA, the deposits there, you're paying as much as you did in rent, you get the equity, and you do it holistically. So it's not like you're putting the onus on one individual out there. It is, you're reviving a community whole scale, and with government capital that will come back, but you need a 10-year, 20-year investment, and then everyone gets that equity. The schools are funded by those taxes. There's if we want to do it, we know how to do it. We've done it before. It's just, do we want to? And we haven't.
Thank you.
Janelle Powell, you've got a great question in the chat, but I want to invite you, if you would like to pose that question yourself, or if not, I'd be happy to read it. But Janelle, would you like to pose a question?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation, Professor Baker. Thank you so much for the space and time to have this conversation. And as I just glanced over at my phone, I saw an article come through, and it said, "A tax code optimized for white wealth leaves Black Americans behind." And I think it's so timely. And I'll revisit the question that I actually put in the chat. From a recommendation from one of my really good friends, Loic, who's also on the call. He shared with me that I should read the book by Eddie S. Glaude, which is called Begin Again. And it talks about the stark reality that we find ourselves in today's society. And he essentially said, until we confront our original sin, which is deeply rooted in racism and capitalism, it's going to be very difficult for us to move the needle in any stretch of the imagination. So from the experts on the call, and from your time in industry, one of the things that I have been disheartened with is that many Americans, we saw through the election that they chose the same thing that they have been choosing for many, many years. And as somebody who's young and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, who's just starting their career and working in a very large company, one of the things I just want to know from people who spent time on the earth longer than I, what is a viable path forward? We hear investments, we hear, just reallocating, wealth and X, Y, and Z, but what is a viable path forward? I really need a task force in place, and I'm willing to, throw throw my hat in the ring, but I'm tired of talking. I'm more about the action piece. So we'll love to hear from anyone on the call.
I mean, I endorse the book that I read everything and anything that Eddie Glaude writes, especially Begin Again, because it's rooted in James Baldwin, and it's a rereading of Baldwin. And I think, Baldwin is someone my editor at one point said, no more Baldwin quotes. You have to pick 10. So I read Fire Next Time. I teach it, and it is probably the most cogent thing ever written about America, period. I think W. Du Bois and James Baldwin are, the two people that you can just read American history by them. And so, yes, action, and talk, I think the thing that we get stuck on, though, are myths and narratives. And so I think once we can retell those narratives, I think action happens, policy shifts. I mean, look at the way that the New Deal dealt with the Great Depression versus how we talk about Black poverty, right? And so I think it's important to get people on the same page about what is the story, what caused this problem, and then you can fix it. Because I think what we have right now, what I hear, what motivated me to write is, oh, well, we need more entrepreneurship, we need more personal responsibility and choices, and people just pick themselves up by the bootstraps and do, and maybe that your generation doesn't think that, but it still comes up a lot. So
Tony,
Okay.
oh, sorry, Chanel. Tony, I see your hand up.
Yes, please. First of all, Professor Baradaran, I just wanted to say thank you for your depiction of the attack of all fronts from a financial standpoint on black banks and the black community. But a question that I had was, how do you suggest that as a community, more than just the African American community, how do we attack the forms of structural racism that have affected Black banks historically and to this date? How do you suggest that we go against that, and what are the first steps that you would recommend that we should take?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, policy, I think getting to the root of it is recognizing how we got here, and not blaming anything on the communities that were victimized by systemic racism, right? And to really absorb what the Kerner Commission was trying to tell us, what the Friedman's bill before it got gutted tried to tell us, what W. Du Bois has been trying to tell us. Like these are structural problems. Racism is baked into the very fabric of our economic system, and to root it out, you have to shift that mindset of blame and of zero sumness, and to really deal with it like we would deal with a recession or poverty. How do we deal with opiate crisis versus crack epidemic, right? Maybe we're not quite there to deal with the opiate crisis yet, but there are some things that we realize are, like the COVID crisis, right? This was an outside thing. We need public policy to fix it. We failed phenomenally, and we're all suffering, right? This is our year anniversary because of absolute public policy failures. But this was an external thing. It was a virus. It's a threat. This is part of it. Is Black communities are not responsible for fixing the thing that was created because of a certain economic system that was based on racial exploitation. And we get rid of the economic systems. We just eradicate slavery. And Brian Stevenson talks about this very cogently. And he was my law professor, so I'm going to flex here. But Brian Stevenson talks about how, when we got rid of slavery, but we had built all these racial myths to justify the system for economics. Same thing after Reconstruction, same thing after civil rights. It's like, well, okay, so we're going to stop slavery, but we justified it as like, well, higher races, lower races. First we used religion, right? Well, God deemed it. And then, we used social Darwinism, right? Darwin itself, well, this is the way that human biology works. And then we use the law of the market. We said, well, supply and demand. And it's, people just, they're getting paid for what the market is worth. And so we never tackled those myths. Once that the exploitative economic system ended, once segregation ended, once Jim Crow ended, we never were like, hey, we told these stories about racism. We told these stories about, Black, the Black race being lower than the white race. Can we just talk about why that we did that? And it is very human to just ignore the past, but it's very American to just assume that progress will just inevitably come, that everything will get better. And other, like the Germans, when the Nazis got expelled from that system painfully, horrifically, after the horrific acts that they did, the Nuremberg trials was very much like they got down into that Nazi ideology and they said, no more. Like we're going to just put the daylight into it. We're going to, get the Nazis, right? As many as we can. And like, they are not welcome in polite society. And what we did with the treasonous Confederates and the slaveholders is just say, you know what, we're good. Here's your land back. Let's just not talk about it. Okay. And South Africa, post-apartheid, they said, like, look, we had this whole system. And I'm not saying those problems are done, but they brought it out and they said, these were the theories that we justified apartheid on, and no more. And we've never had truth and reconciliation, I think, here for slavery. We just want to say, like, let's just forget it happened. Let's just be colorblind and look at people's souls. Well, that's not going to work, right? It's not going to work because those theories are still there. I mean, you see racial eugenics coming back. You're starting to see this IQ BS coming back. We just never purged it. We never said, hey, we had all the pseudoscience that was bunk. Right? It's coming back. It'll come back. I mean, we got Nazis coming back, right? I mean, not fully, right? But anyway, that's a longer soapbox. but truth and reconciliation, just like bring it out, like take out the sins, and just, deal with it.
I see a question from Professor David Falk in the chat. Can the Community Reinvestment Act help with strengthening Black banks or majority minority communities?
It can be strengthened. I talk about the CRA in chapter 7 of my book. I think it is not enough, but yes, it can help. Yeah. I can't talk too much about it for a variety of public policy reasons. Yeah.
Enough said.
Yeah.
Action, academic emphasis.
Yes.
Veronica, I see you put a thoughtful comment in the chat. Would you like to ask a question or make a comment? Well, I will simply read the comment that Veronica put in the chat. I'm saddened that we don't have better answers for our youth. I think one of the things I'm taking away from tonight is that Professor Baradaran does have some answers, and I'm hopeful that our youth on the call tonight are taking this as a challenge, that this is the way you attack a policy problem, is going head on at it. I see Stuart Pittman, another of our distinguished county executives here. Stuart, could I bait you into the conversation? Do you have a question?
Sure. Yeah, I do. And yeah, I'm one of County Executive Baker's mentees. Part of his course in how to be a county executive, he roped a bunch of us newcomers in, and so thank you for doing this, Rishern. And I'm really interested in your comments on Community Reinvestment Act, even though you can't say much, because I was an old community organizer with Acorn back in the day, and marched on the banks and sat across from the table and negotiated agreements with them in faraway places like Des Moines, Iowa, and even then tried to take it to the insurance industry and get them to stop redlining. That didn't go as far, but I'm always looking for a moment, an opportunity, the historical moment to move an agenda, a progressive agenda politically. And so my question is, do you think, I was thrilled today. I was really, 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 really happy today about the American Recovery Act, the $1.9 trillion, and how much of it is going to go into the foundation of our economy and really potentially create wealth for families, for low-income families. But I feel like, and I could be wrong, I'm in a purple county. I got elected here, and I deal with a purple electorate that's a lot like America. And I feel like COVID has changed is a political opportunity, is an opportunity. It's changed the way people feel a little bit about poverty. The people who've been hit hardest by COVID, people are kind of okay with actually doing something to help people for a change. So do you feel like that's made it a lot of things possible?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. You just see in the beginning some slight kind of that old school, like, well, it's underlying conditions and maybe people should just be more careful, like it felt a little bit like there was that personal, like the last gasp of that personal responsibility thing, but immediately became apparent, like, COVID is, if I had another chapter in the book post-COVID, it would be, look at how systemic racism works. You have a virus that affects all bodies equally. And who is getting hit hardest, right? In my book, I keep going back to this quote that I saw from the 1910s, when Wall Street gets a cold, Harlem gets the flu, or Harlem gets pneumonia. There are several variations. And this is what happened. And it was, we hire essential workers. Look at the hospital resources, right? There was this story in New York City of people dying of COVID because there just weren't enough hospital beds and people to attend to COVID patients in certain hospitals versus others. Guess where those hospitals were, right? Guess who had the ability to stay inside their house, like me? I've been home, I've been able to keep my job and pay my rent and get my groceries without ever having to, be exposed to COVID. And so I think quickly people saw, look, you have this thing that is colorblind and it's affecting Black and brown communities at such a vastly different rate. And so what is that? Well, hopefully we can apply that to other things. And in the way that the responses have been, I am also heartened by this last act. I'm heartened by the CARES Act. And the idea that we're kind of beating down, like this idea of inflation. Oh, well, if you overheat the economy, we'll inflate like that. There's a whole a conversation happening in the economist space of just killing that last myth of the Reagan era, or the trickle down economics. And one of the things I think about this that that really highlights that point is that the Wall Street actually didn't get a cold. Harlem got the flu, but Wall Street has been amazing. The capital has been increasing. The private equity. I mean, look at how much wealth has. I mean, the markets are soaring, and so I think people are kind of getting that there's these two different markets going on. There's these two different economies, and one was ravaged by COVID, and some people were able to protect themselves. And this is kind of how these systems work. And you're right. I mean, the child tax, not tax credit, the child provision in the last rescue package, which passed, I thought was the first time we're recognizing that maybe there's a floor for which we don't want children to fall under, right? Maybe what do kids deserve, right? Food, housing, and how are we going to do that, right? Maybe we just pay people money for kids, right? And so I think this has absolutely been a pivot. I really hope that, and I think Trump for all of the pain and suffering that that caused. I think it killed for some the myth of colorblindness. Like we you know, there was a huge backlash to our Black president. It was a whitelash very clearly, and obviously, I think the sort of masks came off, and I think for some people who were not comfortable with that, I think that really motivated people. The Black Lives Matter movement, the George Floyd responses. I think a lot of this stuff is culminating, and I do think we're at that third pivot point. I mean, Reconstruction, civil rights era, and so there are all the risks inherent in the decoys that happened last time. So I hope that we can kind of heed those last pivot points. I think.
Sorry, I'm very struck that your background is in finance and law, but you felt compelled to kind of go into historian mode and dig into those archives because really no one had done it. One of the values of that work, I think, is that I did not know the history of the Freedmen's Bank. And I think the collective shock to the Black community of that bank corruption and failure is in some ways seems a bit parallel to the lack of trust in the system when it comes to things like giving and getting vaccines. There is a long historical memory when something that horrible and that twisted is inflicted on the community. Can you say a little bit more about kind of the remedies when trust is a lack of trust has been unfortunately well earned? How do you begin to enable a community to re-engage the system that unfortunately hasn't earned their trust?
Yeah, you have to earn their trust. I think that's it. I mean, I think people are smart about trust, and I think and the data on the vaccines is mixed. I think I'm not an expert. I think some people are saying no, it's not a distrust. It's just access, right? If you give people access and the information, they will take it, and there is maybe less of a access, less information given because there are just less resources available in some of these communities. I think so. I don't know what the data is, but on the banking side, the distrust is very much there, but it's also access. It is, my first book really dug down into this. Would you rather go to a check casher who takes $10 off your check and gives you that cash, or go to a bank who randomly issues a $35 overdraft fee and piles it on? So sometimes it'll be $150 if you've overdrafted once. And so you can do that rational trade-off. Like, I fundamentally believe that everyone does a cost benefit for their own selves. I think people are smart with money, especially low-income people are much smarter with money. And the data reveals this as well. You ask, there's this great study, ask people when they leave the grocery store, how much money did you spend just now on your total bill? And someone who's low income knows exactly how much everything costs and how much they spent. They can give you exactly where every dollar is going. And someone who's wealthy doesn't have to, and so can't. And so this idea of financial literacy, or you just need to give people information. Well, poor people know exactly where every cent goes. And you're like, well, why did you go to this payday loan? It's like, well, my rent was due, so I could either get evicted, or, I know the costs here to this loan. I know it's not great, but what are my options? So I think treating people as though they are making the best decision given their options is the best way toward public policy, because I think any other way is a cop-out. I think this distrust is real, but I also think it is earned. It is, why would I go to a bank that not only do I feel like crap when I go in there, right? A lot of banks have a history of purposeful, exclusion, the hours, the 3 days it takes to clear checks. So it's distrust, but it's also access, and giving people the right products and the right price, gets you a long way toward restoring trust. So my first book, I kind of ended with more of a easy solution. I talked about postal banking and that history, and I think that there is a place where and I lived in Harlem for a decade, and I just observed the way that Chase Manhattan, their lobby versus the post office lobby, and you really saw the way that certain community spaces worked as a welcoming place and a place that was trusted, even though it's inconvenient, right? I mean, the post office is not anyone's emblem of convenience, but it's a trusted institution, and Chase wasn't, rightfully, as during the subprime crisis at the time. And so, anyway, that's a tangent. You can read the first book on that.
Great. Tony.
So I'm sorry, I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of Black banking and having higher frequency of them, how would you recommend that Black, like members of the Black community, create these Black banks, and B, how do they pertain their standing and get to a level of like a JP Morgan or a Goldman Sachs, because it's like you said, is there's a difference between being like a JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs versus like some local bank in the area. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you get to that same level of prestige is my question.
Yeah, I think the goal is for JP Morgan to have less market share. I think we've had laws in place, that were eradicated over the last 20 years, where every community had similar sized banks. We capped bank size for a reason, so you can have competition. So you can have Black banks that were just as big, and we allowed 5 big banks to dominate a market. You have 80% of the assets being held now by 5 institutions, and they can diversify, but that's not good for anybody. It's certainly not good for the communities that are outside of that system. I think you see it in tech. You see, Amazon. So how do do we want a diverse board at Amazon, or do we just want Amazon to have less market power so other people can compete in these markets? And we have rules for that, right? We have anti-monopoly rules. We have bank rules that aren't being enforced in the way that they should, to give to communities that power to provide for themselves. So on top of just fixing that historic segregation, I think we have to fix that market power scenario. You have too much market power concentrated in too few hands, and that leads to bad policy, and it leads to exploitation. And I think more democracy is always good, more competition is good, and allowing communities to not have to compete against it. You're never going to win against JP Morgan if they have as much market power. They would rather have, they will put the Black Lives Matter sign up, they will diversify their board, and to retain their market share. So that's I think something to watch.
Well, I'd like to give Rashern Baker, our last question, chance to take us out, but I do see one question just before that, Rashern, from Linda Guerin in the chat asks, have you heard of businesses being created as a result of reading your book to help solve the problem?
No, the only thing I've heard create Netflix. Someone at Netflix read my book and convinced the Netflix board, the company, to give $100 million to Black credit unions, and so that was a really proud day. It's just an employee that took it up, and I helped them figure out, we chose a credit union, and they said that was the first of many. And I've heard of other companies doing similar. So just being able to actually invest in Black banks. I don't think that that's the answer. I don't think we need to be relying on philanthropy, but it was still a good outcome. Netflix actually does other stuff. So Netflix is a content producer. It's not a lender. So, and it does produce content that is good. So I felt good about working with them on that initiative.
Rashern, why don't you take us out here?
Thank you, Dinor. Professor Baradaran, everybody is, chatting not only on the chat, but also texting me. So you've made me people appreciate being over here in Maryland. But I didn't want to leave without asking, a question around, I've heard you talk about public schools and the connection between the wealth gap and property values and funding our education system. And since I know that we have county executives and mayors and county judges, and for us, that's where we live and die, is property values, education, and trying to get people to move in. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that as the closeout question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I, you know, every you dig back a layer of the onion in anything that we have, the tax code, the property codes, anything, and it gets down to racism and segregation being the problem here. And if you look at the schools, the way the school funding works and the way that local property taxes work is that you get resources based on the property taxes in the area, and you have real districting that keeps resources in these schools. There's a new term for it that I've heard, like the opportunity hoarding, right? So some neighborhoods are able to hoard the resources for their kids, and I mean it goes back to this idea of our kids and other people's kids. And I think as a mom of 3 kids, I hear this stuff. This is when you go to buy a house, when you go to decide on a school and you choose a private or public school. And I will be clear, my kids go to public school in the neighborhoods that I've been in. And I've tried to pick a neighborhood that is as, economically diverse. And my kids haven't suffered because my kids are going to be fine. And it is about the school resources and access and whose kids, a lot of parents were like, well, I don't want to send my kids to that school. And my response is always like, well, whose kids should go to that school, right? If that school's not good enough for my kids, whose kids is it good enough for? And then you have to name them. Like, what kind of kids do you think deserve that school? And I think that's at the basis of a lot of these things is we have this idea that what's not good enough for my kids is good enough for those other people's kids. And I think that needs to go away. And especially when we're talking about kids. And I think this was a COVID issue too. And when you hear about kids who don't have laptops, who are remote learning, who don't have lunches at school. And I think people are like, well, that's not okay, right? That's not okay. And I think a lot of parents, we make these decisions and we make the decisions on where to buy homes and what the activities that we engage in our private schools. And I think this is where it gets personal for people, and I usually don't like this part in the conversation because people do start to shift because you say, well, I want to send my kids to a private school. Well, yes, I understand that, I understand that need, but then we should just fix that system. And so that we don't have to have those resources going out. So we can taxes, if we're not going to integrate kids, we can integrate taxes. So every school gets the same dollars. So we can hire the same amount of teachers and the same resources, and then we'll get there.
No, I think that's a great answer. The reason I heard you answer the question before, and the reason I think it's so important, especially for those who are leading cities, counties, is that, especially in this new era that we're in, and everyone's, has woken up and everyone's, wants to move forward. But the question for executives, is what are you willing to give up? And part of the giving up is just what you said about our public school systems. If you're a county executive like County Executive Pittman or the county executive in Westchester County, really the value of your county is based on your public school system. So if you had a great public school system, your property values are up. If you have a struggling public school system, and I was, county executive of Prince George's County, which is the wealthiest African-American county in the country, but yet our property values compared to someplace else was less because of the makeup of the school. And I think having people realize that part of that is we're going to have to give up something if we're going to make the changes. So I appreciate the book you've written. I actually was going after the other book, How the Other Half Bank, because I like those ideas, but it's a brilliant book. And thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Rashern, for inspiring the conversation tonight, to Aisha Washington for making it all happen, and especially to Professor Baradaran for a truly exciting evening. I think, truth be told, you are actually a policy professor masquerading as a law professor. So
Don't say anything.
you're welcome in our
Thank
family
you.
anytime. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thanks
Thank you
very
everyone
much.
for joining.